how did both of you end up in the management department with such varying educational and work backgrounds?
Jim, you preceded me at Webster University, not in the management department, but at Webster University. Why don't
Yeah, I
you
guess I
start
got here,
with-
what, 1 year before you did?
I came in '76, so I think you were a couple
4,
years.
okay, I got here
You
in
were a
70.
veteran when I
That's
when I
right,
arrived.
I was here, came here in '72. Well, so I came as teaching philosophy.
Oh, I came to teach political science.
Yeah, and so the two of us then ended up in a management department.
Yes, by strange pathways to some, at least strange for a typical academic institution, I think.
Well, you've said two important things. We've never been a typical academic institution, although maybe we're becoming one, more typical. And second, that there wasn't a management department, so it wasn't quite as hard to come in from the outside because everyone did.
Well, that's right, and when you came, there wasn't even a management program. By the time I came in 1976, in January of 1976, Doris Butemiller had been here for a year and a half, and she had started the undergraduate management department and was headquartered in the fourth floor of the administration building, now called Webster Hall, and I was in the political science department, which was on the third floor with psychology and sociology, and it wasn't when I came. I was the first full-time faculty member to have a contract that obligated me to teach part of my load in the graduate programs, because the graduate programs were, and we may want to talk about that in a second, but the graduate programs were distinct from the undergraduate programs, and the academic departments didn't really run the graduate programs. Those were run out of the graduate office. So when I came, I started teaching first public administration, and then some administration of justice, and ultimately health administration in the graduate program.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I migrated towards the management department. And you were administrator for a number of years, and
Though that came somewhat later, but you're right. That was the crucial turn, because when I got here, there was already a graduate program in education that Webster had been well known for in the area, with the Master of Arts in Teaching. I think of all the Carnegie Foundation programs, ours was the only MAT that they funded that was for in-service teachers, was aimed at working adult teachers. They were already certified to teach, they were in education, they were teaching, and that was underway. But other than that...
didn't they also have a branch of that in Kansas City?
And they had developed, or about when I got here, they developed a branch of that in Kansas City. So we had a model of education, partly at night, although for the MAT heavily in the summer, because they were teachers, that was aimed at working adults, so they were already professionals and coming back to school rather than traditional age students. Then we had the conservatory, the theater conservatory, which was our infamy in the community for the crazy kids that worked all night and ran around the community. And we had an undergraduate college that you were in political science, I was in the philosophy department. And all of a sudden this accretion developed.
And the management program, when I first came, there were a few full-time undergraduate students in management, but most of them were in the evening and going part-time. And so by the mid 70s, we had started the undergraduate degree completion program for students, and I remember both even in the day classes as well as in those evening classes, a lot of women were coming back to finish their degree, and that we were a friendly place, both our format and small classes and things like that, and we were a friendly place for women who had perhaps raised their families, or the kids were in school, and they were coming back to get a degree so that they could join the workforce.
Yeah. I think that was also part of the reputation that Webster had. Having been Webster College for the Sisters of Loretto, a private Catholic college for women, there was a sense, probably more comfort on the part of women returning to college. It's always, the university, it's always a little scary to go back to school when you haven't been in school because of that history, which is now, you know, almost 50 years ago. But that was part of it. I don't know if this is fact or just how a mistaken memory, but my recollection is that we sort of backed into the undergraduate by discovery of a market. We moved initially, I thought, to try to expand graduate programs in business and management related areas, and discovered a pent-up demand for people who had never finished their college degree and now wanted to enter
I think
labor force.
that's right. I mean, the beginnings of the graduate program go back to, like you say, around the time that you came in the early 1970s, and this was before I came, but apparently it started out with a list of courses. It was called the MAI, Master of
Right.
Arts Individualized, and it was a list of courses in management and marketing and business, and the student could come in and kind of build your own degree, very 60-ish, 70-ish approach, and the students could kind of pick and choose classes and build their own degree, and apparently pretty quickly that the administrative difficulty of that became evident, and so then they started to be packaged into an MA in marketing and an MA in management, and that was kind of the beginnings of the graduate program. And then the big leap came when, at that early stage, when the general from Scott Air Force Base knew Bill Duggan, who was at the time the graduate dean and had kind of started the graduate programs, and asked him to bring the program to Scott Air Base. And I guess it was about the same time they took the program to a military base near Chicago, I think. And
Great Lakes Naval Station.
Station.
Yeah, that's
And so between those two, we started to take those graduate programs to military bases and use local faculty, and that was really the beginning of the kind of worldwide Webster system. And because Scott Air Force Base was the world headquarters of the Military Airlift Command, that kind of gave us an entree into some other Air Force bases around the country.
That was also, as I recall it, a really crucial moment with respect to getting buy-in from the faculty in the college, which I know from personal experience was not always the easiest thing to do. But Neil George, and perhaps did you teach at Scott on occasion?
Once or twice I taught at Scott.
Our colleagues in the full-time faculty, like you and Neil,
who was chair of the political science department at that time.
Right. Teaching at Scott found the students really stimulating. And so to teach, for Neil to teach a course in an international subject with people who were flying around the world between classes that met once a week, brought a lot to the table, and a different kind of experience of international relations and international difficulties. A lot of the people at Scott had served in Vietnam. There was a whole new stimulus in the classroom that I think really helped cement the support in the institution at large for doing what otherwise seemed a kind of opportunistic thing. Yeah, I think mentioning Neil and then hiring you, that really, looking back on it, was I think a crucial move in the possibility of the development of the management department the way it has eventually emerged. Chuck Madden had hired Doris Butenmiller,
The undergraduate
the
dean.
undergraduate dean at the time, had hired Doris Butenmiller to as an economist to manage these returning adult students for undergraduate degrees. But because we had somebody like you that had academic experience and expertise in administration, and you didn't mention in your little introduction, also in healthcare. These were very, very fortuitous things, because it meant that as our program developed, there was, looking back on it, a way to distinguish between the administrative organizational studies side of things, human behavior side of things, and the financial econometric side of things, which made it two departments eventually possible, management and business, but also put us in position to be able to provide service and develop a market for people in healthcare. I mean, that's...
And when I first came, police officers,
Yeah.
because when I first came, one of the things that I ended up getting into and doing because of my public administration background was running the LEAP program. I did that for 2 or 3 years, and that was a grant program from the federal government that enabled us to do significant tuition reduction for police officers coming into our
law
administration.
enforcement, but I can't remember what the P is program. Assistance program. Yeah, yeah.
And we had a lot of police officers, and I remember once a year, usually in the summer, I would teach a class downtown that was all police officers, and after the first couple of classes, it struck me that I was the only person in the room that didn't have a gun. But it didn't hamper or impede discussion and so on. And at one point, when the city of St. Louis was looking for a new police chief, and they had the pictures and bio sketches of the 5 or 6 candidates, and I think 3 of them were Webster graduates, and I know there may have been others, but I know Clarence Harmon ultimately became police chief and then mayor of St. Louis, and he was a graduate of Webster's Administration of Justice program. So we had that program going, and we had the health administration program going, which I got involved in, and then ultimately ran for 3 decades, I guess, But to come back to kind of the administrative organization and how the management department developed, when I first came, there was the graduate programs were run out of the graduate dean's office, and there were 2 PhDs who were assistants to the dean, and the dean himself had a doctorate, but none of them were faculty. They were administrators, and they would assemble faculty from for curriculum review and things like that. They would assemble faculty from Little Rock and various other places around the system. And I remember that I got to know some of the people that taught for us for years across the system by going to those meetings and participating. But it was still the graduate program run by the graduate administration, and the full-time faculty in the undergraduate college were kind of apart. A number of them taught in the graduate program, but they taught kind of like adjuncts in addition to their regular load. So from the early 80s forward, there was kind of an ongoing set of discussions about how to regularize, if you will, and as more faculty came on board by the early 1980s, some more business and management faculty came on board, and people like Don Westerfield and Tom Quirk and so forth. But we still had this kind of bifurcated structure in which the graduate programs were run administratively, and the undergraduate programs were part of the traditional.
No, that's right, and that also was an important period of transition. I mean, Neil, I worked with Neil in the days in which we created the Graduate Council, which was sort of a leg in for some form of faculty control or influence, at least, in those graduate programs.
That must have been about the mid-1970s.
That was-
I
that was- that was
think
in
that
the-
was already in place when I came in 76.
That was in the mid-70s, and the crucial moment there was when the transition that you talked about from the MAI, the independent, build your own program, to programs, established programs with a set curriculum and the magic 12 courses magically divided like Play-Doh, 7 in the area and 5 electives. And when we had these in specific areas, then there needed to be some correlate of the undergraduate curriculum committee for the graduate programs, and the graduate council took on that role.
And it was a joint administrative faculty committee, if I remember. There were some administrators on it, and there were some faculty from the undergraduate, and that was kind of the first step of involving the faculty in a formal way in the governance of the graduate program.
Yeah, it was sort of a German workers' council concept of the management, the administration, and the faculty both had votes on the committee, though there were seldom, as in any committee, seldom very sharply divided votes. But that was important also in continuing to build that support for the programs, because of the testimony that the graduate council got about the quality and ambition of the students, and because of the interaction that it had with these people teaching the adjunct force, which now outnumbered us quickly by factors of 10 and powers of 10, that developed this mechanism to keep it all one university.
We probably shouldn't pass from a discussion of the period of the 1970s and the transition from Webster College as a Catholic women's school to the kind of institution it is today, without making some reference to Joe Kelly, who in his own way, I think, was perhaps the single most influential figure in the development of Webster as it has, well, you talk about him first, but one little story that I remember that's kind of a lesson for us all is a couple of years after he retired and had been this kind of legendary figure, someone sent an email around saying, "I have a package for Joseph Kelly. Does anybody know who he is?" But why don't you talk a little bit about your experiences with Joe and the importance of Joe for the institution?
Again, Joe came out of an administrative background. He'd been a political operative in Montana.
But also had a PhD in political science.
But also had a PhD in political science. So he knew how to organize and direct energy to a particular kind of purpose. In our sort of bland language now, he was the chief operating officer, but he was the vice president. Lee Jardine had a very high profile in the community, was associated with the arts.
The president.
He was the president, but the day-to-day management of the place, and I think it's fair to say most of the vision for the development of the institution came from Joe, both from his he had a hyperactive mind. He was always. I remember that he used to always teach a class, and his class basically he'd teach a class early in the morning to undergraduates, and it basically involved reading from the morning newspaper. And you'd start
current events with Joe Kelly.
Absolutely current events, and you'd start the subject, and it would partly be recollection, like we're doing, of things that he'd encountered personally, but it was also always aimed back at students to stimulate them. And he had a sense of people that might have abilities that they hadn't recognized and that might fit in, and an instinct that we had to somehow manage as an organization to bring in new blood from outside, but to keep letting people develop and move in different directions within the institution. And you're right, Joe was key in that, giving the opportunity to Bill Duggan and particularly to Neil, that turned out to be the dominant players in the early development, and Neil all the time that you and I have been here.
Yeah, and Neil became, when Chuck Madden retired as undergraduate dean, Neil became, that was in the early 80s, Neil became the undergraduate dean and was in that role for a number of years, so that by the early 80s you had Neil as the undergraduate dean and Bill Duggan as the graduate dean, and Joe Kelly presiding over the overall administration.
And then Neil, with Joe's blessing and approval, I mean that was the opportunity that came my way to move from teaching philosophy to moving into administration. We had a problem, as periodically happens, with the licensure, the certification of the teacher certification program, based in confusion and unhappiness with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Jefferson City, and we were coming up for a difficult review, and they were pushing some kind of administrative reform on us, and so basically Joe and Neil cobbled together a committee that they thought had 2 members each of the 2 opposing factions, and appointed me chair as the neutral party, since I knew nothing about it. And that ended up with making some recommendations that brought the MAT program into the common structure of the graduate programs, but also clarified the role of teacher education, teacher certification within the Department of Education, undergraduate department, which was created at the time. And that project was just winding down when in the, just before Christmas in 1982, Neil asked me in passing, how would you like to go to Holland? And I said, sure.
For how long?
And so basically, with no background of doing any of these things, when Chuck Madden, who had gone to start the Webster program in Holland, retired, I went over there to be the director of Webster's program in Holland, which was the second of our international programs, both of which developed as opportunities out of the history you sketched earlier, starting in Scott Air Force Base. So in the late 70s, the city of Geneva was giving encouragement to the notion that there would be a graduate education opportunity in English in Geneva for internationals who were there. And because we had this network of ear to the ground out there, and the good fortune that a colleague from a neighboring university in the St. Louis area couldn't interest his university in that opportunity, said, well, what about Webster? And we decided that there would be a market to offer graduate master's programs to students in Geneva, expecting that our student body was going to be so-called what the international community calls trailing spouses. So bored spouses who happened to be in Geneva because their husband or wife had a job. Turned out the trailing spouses already had master's degrees, most of them. They turned into our faculty. But an opportunity there for a program developed moved the same kind of model that we had for degree completion undergraduates here and master's students here into an international setting, which again people from the campus here, when they went to teach, found very stimulating. You had 20 students in a class, and among them they lived in 40 countries and spoke 25 languages. This was a whole new thing. And so the next step from that was we opened a program a few years later in Leiden. And so I went to Holland
And in
became
Vienna,
an administrator.
and in Vienna about the same time, I think.
And in between, you're right, in between Geneva and Leiden, we opened in Vienna.
But so when did the management program become a department?
I'll drop a second back to Joe Kelly again, and when Neil, in the early 1980s, when Neil had been for a year or two the equivalent of the president of the faculty senate, and then when he became dean, he resigned from that position, and I succeeded him in that role, and that involved having breakfast once a week. Joe Kelly's part of Joe Kelly's administrative style was that people that he dealt with, he would have breakfast with, and I quickly learned that the morning that I had breakfast with Joe Kelly, I needed to clear my schedule for the entire morning, because you'd meet him about 8 o'clock, and depending on what else he had to do and what he felt like talking about and what stories he wanted to tell, it might be 11 o'clock before I got back from breakfast at Schnucks with Joe Kelly. And so for the 4 years that I was president of the then equivalent to the faculty senate, once a week I met with Joe Kelly, and a wide-ranging discussions. And part of Kelly's style and the storytelling and so on was a way of socializing people who had come more recently into the history and of the place and so forth. And along the way, we were getting ready to build the new Swerdrup Center, because their classroom space was getting tight, and we had temporarily rented a junior high school building next door to Webster's campus. Sought to buy it and could not. A developer who wanted to build condominiums bid twice what we were willing to pay for it, and so the administration and the board decided we needed to build a new building. And I remember as that was coming along, and the process of building a building was coming along, one morning at breakfast, Joe Kelly said to me, because in my role as Senate President, and I had kind of 1 foot in the management program because of my role with the health administration, and then one foot in the political science department still. And Joe said to me one morning, he said, he said, we're building this new building. It's going to be the business and technology building, and it's going to house communications, but most importantly, it's going to house the faculty and in business and management. And he said, you need to go full bore into that department and work on, because at that time we had 2 or 3 faculty, Doris and 2 or 3 other faculty, and he said, you need to go in there and take a leadership role in trying to build a faculty. He said, we need to build a faculty, we've got a building, we need to build a faculty, and I'd like you to go in. It's kind of a similar thing to what you described, that Joe trying to pick people to do that. And by that time I had been several years on the Crestwood Board of Aldermen, which Joe liked because Joe was a politician at heart, and I guess he thought I'm not sure he knew what my management skills were, but I guess he thought my political skills were reasonably good, and that trying to build a faculty would require that. And so that was kind of the beginnings, and simultaneously with that, the management program, Doris and others in the faculty of the management program went to the faculty assembly and the administration and said we're now ready to convert this from a program to a department. And so the management department was created in the, maybe 85, 86, but still the management department was an undergraduate department. And the graduate programs still rested in the office of the graduate dean in terms of responsibility for curriculum, scheduling, and all of those kinds of things. And clearly what Joe Kelly wanted to do, and was his kind of strategic vision, is that he felt that we couldn't continue to grow and expand business and management education without having a more traditional academic structure. That it couldn't continue to be run out of the graduate dean's office, that we needed, and that wouldn't ultimately pass accreditation muster and things like that. So his vision was to end this bifurcated structure and to have a management or a business and management department that would be responsible for both graduate programs and undergraduate programs.
And that was a gutsy move. Just a few years before I got here, I got here in 1972, the fall of '72. But I don't know if it was 1970 or 1969, but we, apart from a friendly banker, we would have missed payrolls. So the institution was really, really running cash poor, and was really running on a margin. And then as the graduate and working adult programs developed with this model of providing the classes when you already had the clientele, and teaching through the use of a lot of adjunct faculty, we had a pretty healthy bank account. The cash flow was very good in that business, but one of the reasons that the cash flow was good was that apart from the theater, which almost bankrupted us before I got here, building that building, we had only buildings that were 50 years old. And the decision to build a new building,
the Swerdrup building,
was a gutsy one. And then the achievement, and I can't remember when Lee retired. Was Lee still here then?
No, it would have been, yes, he would have still been here. Lee retired in the early 90s, I think.
I think so too.
Succeeded by Daniel Perlman.
Because Lee Jardine, because the amazing thing about that building is not only did Joe, I think you're right, it was Joe that was in the leadership there, not only did he have the vision that we needed some bricks and mortar despite the fact that we were generating a lot of cash in order to sustain this program over the long term, but they built a quality building. I remember the review that Frank Peters, the music and architect critic in the Post-Dispatch, wrote about what a miracle of design it was to build a building in 3 segments that sits so beautifully on that what otherwise would have been an awkward-looking corner. And it's a surprisingly big building for its appearance.
About 65,000 square feet, if I remember.
And it doesn't look nearly that big when you drive past it, but it's because of that articulation.